pretty nice background. It actually looks like we're maybe driving up to whatever this is, Sami. So what would you like to order? No, can you talk to us about what this concept is that we're seeing behind us?
Absolutely. Well, first, thanks for having me, Jason. And I know it's lunchtime or almost lunchtime, and I stand in the way of your lunch, so we'll try to keep it quick. But this is one of our new design concepts, and I think you mentioned Peter was here last year talking about 6 new design concepts we have at Popeyes. This is one of them, and I think it is a glimpse into where we're headed. I think you see the design elements for sure, which I think present really nicely, but I think and I know we're going to get into this, but a lot more digital elements, a lot more team member focused elements that kind of improve that guest experience and that team member experience holistically.
Great, yeah, we definitely want to jump into the different things you're experimenting with. They've got a lot that they're experimenting with, and we've got some images that are cycling by as well, and we'll probably jump into those, but let's take it back a bit, just a bit of an overview of Popeyes in general, and I mean, bring us to where we are right now. Where are you guys?
Sure, so we are really excited. It is Popeyes' 50th anniversary this year. We were founded in 1972, and I think for those of you who are less familiar with Popeyes, we were founded in Louisiana, outside of New Orleans, and we have this distinct Cajun Southern hospitality in our roots. And the food is very, very rooted in that. And so a lot of people don't know actually, and to this day, the bone-in chicken comes in fresh into our restaurants. It's never frozen, comes in fresh a couple times a week. It is marinated by hand 12 hours every night so that the chicken you get the next day is all fresh and hand battered, hand breaded, and then fried for 12 minutes. So there is this unique culinary heritage that goes into every piece of Popeyes bone-in chicken. And then when you think about where the brand's been the last few years, we actually are the #1 player of bone-in chicken in the US. But in the last few years, we had this thing called the sandwich. And I hear the chuckles because a lot of people remember what happened when the sandwich came out. It was about 2 years ago now, and it, as we like to say, broke the internet. There was actually one tweet about the sandwich every 17 seconds for 3 months. It was absolutely insane for us. But it took our brand from being this sort of niche kind of QSR brand to putting us on the national main stage. And since then, we've leaned into that. And so the sandwich broadened kind of our appeal to new groups, new demographics, and then we've kind of broadened that appeal over the last few years into now one of the fastest growing restaurant concepts in the US, which we're really proud of.
Yeah, and I definitely want to, you've brought us there really lovely, in terms of, last year, around 200 new restaurants.
Yep.
This coming year, in your 50th year, you're going to be another 200 or more in North America alone, not counting your international development. You talked us through some of the reasons why there's been that explosion in popularity. What else? What else is happening to elevate the brand and make it such a craveable place to go?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's sort of worth taking maybe a 2-year step back, which is we unveiled the chicken sandwich and long lines and sort of national media behind it. But what actually happened, call it 5 months later, 4 months later, was the pandemic. And as everyone knows, it changed life in our industry. But what we saw in our business, which was fantastic, was #1, we were able to protect the health and safety of our team members and our guests and pivot very quickly to putting in new ops procedures. But what we also saw about our business was that fried chicken does really well on delivery, on digital. And actually, after pizza, fried chicken is the #2 category for home delivery. And so we really leaned into that trend. Delivery was not a big part of our business pre-pandemic. It's now close to 15% of our business. And that year, 2020, was actually one of the best years on history that we've ever had because we leaned into not only the delivery business, but also the idea of a family occasion. So Popeyes does really incredibly well when it comes to family occasions and bigger group eating. And during the pandemic, when folks were at home and maybe they were tired of ordering pizza for every meal, it was, we have our family together, let's order some of these family meals. And so family became a much bigger part of our mix. Obviously higher check size and more guests, and that also broadened our appeal. So coming out of 2020, we had this immense growth, and what that did was actually drive record franchise profitability for our franchisees. So Popeyes in 2021 and beyond, we have one of the best paybacks on new restaurant development. And that's really, I think, what's propelled this growth engine. I think it was started at the top line, but it translated into really good ROIs for our franchisees on new restaurant development.
Which is equated to, you've now got the longest wait period for franchisees coming on board, is that right, that you've ever had?
Yeah, so another thing we did coming out of the pandemic was, or at least, sort of coming out of the onset of the pandemic, was we decided to actually start welcoming new franchisees into our system. And today we have one of the longest wait lists we've ever had for new franchisees to enter the system. Number one, I think because the paybacks are so good, as I mentioned, but also because the brand is really hot right now. And I think people, as they look at chicken, as they look at QSR, people like the category. I think fried chicken, as many of you know, is one of the fastest growing categories, not just in the US, but all the way around the world. And I think it was that sort of macro and micro momentum that we had in the category and at the brand that drove unprecedented interest from franchisees. And so we welcomed a lot of new partners into the system last year, and they're already building new restaurants, and we're gonna continue to bring new partners into the system, and also grow with our existing partners, because we have a lot of really great franchisees all around the US.
Great. Well, I just, again, step back a bit further. I just would like to find out how you sort of came into the company. I mean, and I've been writing the marketing materials for this event, and Sami Siddiqui, President of Popeyes and, RBI veteran. Not to make you sound like you're incredibly old or anything like that, but I mean, you've been at RBI now for about a decade, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
So I guess, can you take us through what your journey's been like with the company, and then, what happened when you arrived at Popeyes? What did you find?
Sure. I was joking with the team earlier today. I said it's the first time that anyone's ever referred to me as an industry veteran, and it's a really cool feeling, but...
You're welcome.
But thank you, yeah. So you're my hype man. But so been with RBI for 10 years, and for those of you who don't know what Restaurant Brands International is we're a global restaurant company, about $30 billion of sales, and we own restaurant brands. So we own Burger King, obviously Popeyes, we own Tim Hortons, and as of last month or 2 months ago, we now own Firehouse Subs. So a large kind of restaurant holding company that's publicly traded. Our brands have kind of collective history of 200 plus years, but RBI is actually a relatively young company. So the company was founded just under a decade ago, and I've been with the company since the beginning. I started on the Burger King side. We're based in Miami, so not too far from here. And I helped lead our acquisition of Tim Hortons, which created Restaurant Brands back in 2014. And from there, I spent 4 years leading the Tim Hortons business in Canada, which was an incredible experience. For those of you who are familiar with Tim's, you know what an incredible brand it is. And then after 4 years in Toronto, I decided I wanted to try my hand at Asia. So I moved out to Singapore, and I was president of RBI's Asia business, which is all of our brands consolidated, with about 3,000 restaurants and our fastest growing restaurant business anywhere in the world. And as part of that, actually got very acquainted with Popeyes because we were entering so many new markets in Asia. For example, China, the Philippines, now India. So got sort of up to speed on kind of the Popeyes brand at that time. Was actually, during my time in Asia, was actually on the ground in China in January of 2020 when the pandemic started, which was a surreal experience. I'll tell you about it over a drink sometime. But it was a surreal experience, and then came back to lead Popeyes a couple months into the pandemic.
Okay, thank you for that journey, and you're probably wondering, why did he ask that history? But I do want to come back to that.
Sure.
So you got to Popeyes, and what was the lay of the ground? What were the things you immediately thought, this is what we got to do, and this is what it maybe isn't working so well?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think a lot of the times, and we have a lot of restaurant leaders in the audience today, I think a lot of the times you walk into a new role or you walk into a new opportunity, and you're often tapped on the shoulder because it's a quote unquote turnaround, right? You're walking into something that may be broken or has a ton of opportunity, and I think it was sort of refreshing for me, because to walk into Popeyes during this very tumultuous time was actually sort of a breath of fresh air, because Popeyes had this incredible success on the heels of the sandwich. Our digital business was growing, and I think the mandate for me has been a lot about how do you take this good brand to being a great brand, and how do you really build a growth engine around the incredible momentum that we've had. And that's exactly what we did. So, of course, we're in the pandemic. The number one thing that I focused on was how do we build our digital business? Because coming from my time in Asia, where digital sales in our business there represented 30, 40, 50% of sales, in Korea, actually it was 80% of our sales. So it was thinking a lot about how we build that digital business, our loyalty platform. We didn't have a loyalty program. We have a loyalty program today with 5 million users. And how do we build those channels, including the restaurants, to support digital was a big part of the growth engine. I think the second piece was just general growth. And I think, one of the things when we talk to guests, and we run a lot of guest surveys, the number one barrier to trial for Popeyes is convenience. I've heard of your restaurants, I've heard of your brand, but there's no Popeyes near me. I haven't seen one, I haven't driven by one. And we have nearly 3,000 restaurants in North America, but convenience remains by a mile the biggest barrier to trial. So for us, it was, how do we bridge that convenience gap? And it was, of course, it was build more restaurants and be more accessible, but it was also build your digital presence, right? Delivery makes you that much closer to the guest. And so I think if you can do that while simultaneously elevating the service levels, that is sort of the holy grail for us. That's what we've been focused on over the last year and a half.
Yeah, and fast forward to now. You were telling me just before, you're running around 50 different experiments right now at any given time?
I lose count, but yeah, something like that.
All right, let's list them one by one. No, I'm joking.
I'll bring Peter up on stage.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, look, okay, so that's pretty phenomenal. But I mean, that's been a common experience for a lot of brands, right? Everyone's experimenting, everyone's trialing different things, whether it's high concept stuff or stuff that's on the ground. So, I mean, to have this turnaround, so to speak, I mean, what have you done during this period to encourage that and maintain it? Especially when it's not been a very easy time. It's been a bit of a stressful time for your teams, right?
Yeah, look, I think we heard it this morning from a lot of the panelists, and it's sort of become a cliche at this point, but COVID accelerated everything I'm sure everyone in the audience was working on. And I think for us, we were in a particularly unique spot because we had the ability to be a lot more nimble, I'd say, than a lot of other brands. I think with around 3,000 restaurants, it's still not a huge system in the US. It's a large system, but it's not the behemoth system. So we could pivot pretty quickly. And we were fortunate that what we saw was, like I said, a growing delivery business, but also a business where the mix was changing a little bit. And so what the chicken sandwich actually showed us even before the pandemic was that our restaurants were built for the past. They were built to do a certain amount of sales volume, and the chicken sandwich took us from doing about $1.4 million on the top line to doing $1.8 million. And if you don't build your restaurants to do $1.8 million, or ideally something much, much greater in the future, then it's gonna limit you in your ability to execute on that guest experience. And so that was actually what drove a lot of the innovation. And it was, how do we now innovate in formats? And how do we think holistically about being where the guest is? I think as you go back to this idea of convenience being the number one barrier, then it comes down to, when we look at trade areas, how do we think about what sort of formats to put in what sort of places? Because I think the antiquated notion and the way we probably approached development a few years ago, if we're being honest with ourselves, was we needed to have 3,000 square foot boxes with drive-throughs, and we need to wait for that real estate. And as many of you know, because you deal with the municipalities, those things can't get permitted, those things can't get zoned, and it's gonna take 5 years to be in a spot. So what did we say? Well, let's plant a flag. Let's get on the street, let's get on the corner we want, and if we need to be flexible with format, kitchen size, dining room size, we'll do it. And that's what we've done.
Yeah, that's what I want to jump into now, because prior to the pandemic, you had your main was like a 76-seater. Yeah. So 18-month period, you got 6 new prototypes. What have you come up with? Maybe that we can list.
Well, no, it's a great point. I think pre-pandemic we were building 76-seat restaurants. Now the largest in our prototypes, the largest seating I think is about 36 seats, and it goes down to no seats at all. And that's just one example of flexibility. But I think this idea of planting the flag, as I was mentioning, was we need to be flexible with seating, we need to be flexible with kitchens, a little bit more modular. and then figure out where we can be. So for example, I think we were talking about ghost kitchens. We're testing ghost kitchens in a number of locations because, quite frankly, we couldn't get a freestanding restaurant there. You know, there were trade areas we'd been looking at, and we said, you know, we can't get there. You know, I'll give you, in South Miami, actually, we opened a digital-only walk-up. And the reason we opened that concept was because we'd been looking at that trade area for 3 or 4 years, just couldn't get a drive-through. So we said, why don't we open a concept here? Let's see how it does while we wait for the drive-through, because there should be a drive-through in the trade area, and see how it does. And what we're seeing with that digital-only walk-up is we're going to get our payback in less than a year. And so if you can get a payback in less than a year for a franchisee, it actually gives them a business case to start thinking about, wow, I should think bigger in this trade area, and I should experiment. And I think that's what testing and learning really gets us.
Okay. And let's strip it back a bit further then. So it's not just the formats that you're toying around with, so you've also undergone a complete redo of the kitchen, right? So talk us through what the problems were there that led into this, and what have you got now?
Yeah, it's been interesting because, as I mentioned, when the chicken sandwich took our volumes from about $1.4 million to $1.8 million on the top line, we realized we had a bit of a problem, which was that, you know, if you're at $1.8 million on the average, it means you have restaurants that are doing $2.5–3 million on the top line at the high end. And our kitchens weren't built to do a lot more than $3 million on the high end. So we had to rethink how our kitchens were set up. The other thing that kind of drove this decision was the staffing crunch that we saw, that we have seen over the last year or so. And what we saw was there were a lot of tasks that go into our back of house preparation that are very labor intensive and actually can detract from the team member experience. So one of the things that I do constantly is when I'm in the restaurant, I will go to the most tenured team members in that restaurant and I'll say, if there's 1 or 2 things you can change about this restaurant, what would it be? And what we saw was a lot of it was around chicken preparation. And so, for example, because we're hand battering, hand breading everything, and then we're frying everything, it can be time intensive to take chicken out of a hot fryer and move it over to what we call the bird cage, which is where we store our chicken. It's hot, it's heavy, and it's a lot of steps. So we had engineers come in, they measured, they monitored all the steps that a team member takes in their day and cut it down. And so we reoriented our fryers, we reoriented where the bird cage holding unit is to minimize steps from those fryers and actually improve the safety for our team members. And so that was one thing we did. Another example is, you know, like I said, we hand batter and bread. The bags of flour are 40-pound bags. That 40-pound bags are, you know, when you're doing that all day, it's a time-intensive and really strenuous job. So we try to minimize kind of how many steps they take with those bags of flour. We did a full redo of the kitchen, and we're now in test with those kitchens.
Okay. Have you got a timeline in terms of retrofitting older kitchens?
I hope faster.
Okay.
Is my goal.
Okay.
We're taking our time because we want to get it right. But I think part of this is they're already under construction, and when you're opening as many new restaurants as we are in the U.S., which, you know, as you mentioned, we opened over 200 restaurants in the U.S. and Canada last year, which was our best year in the history of our brand. Is when you're building that many, you want to get these things to market really quickly because you don't want to be building old prototypes. You don't want to be building old layouts when you have something new and shiny in front of you.
Okay. You mentioned ghost kitchens before as well. So how much are you pushing forward with that? What does that look like specifically for you? I know you're not just with one avenue into this segment, but many. So what's the overview?
Yeah, I think ghost kitchens, which, you know, the presenter this morning, Benjamin, talked a lot about ghost kitchens and a bunch of other formats that I think are truly exciting. Our approach is simply test and learn. And we want to be testing everything and learning from those concepts. I think, you know, ghost kitchens, it's one of these things that I think we've talked about in the industry for quite some time now. And actually, going back to my time in Asia, you know, in Singapore and China and other markets, we were opening ghost kitchens, and they were doing really, really well. And I think the interesting thing about ghost kitchens here in the U.S. is I'm not sure if we've quite figured out the model yet. I think there are a lot of things that are under test, but we have to figure out an economic model for ghost kitchens that work for the franchisees, that work for the ghost kitchen providers, and that work for the guest ultimately. And so our idea is, and I was touring a ghost kitchen last week, it's how do we get these to profitability? And once you get them to profitability, then you kind of start to scale them. And I think as we look at the US, no one's really figured out how to do it at scale yet, but I think there's some promising new ideas, there's some promising concepts that I think could get it there over the next few years.
Okay. You referred to Ben before in his presentation and what's happening abroad with ghost kitchens. And generally, I mean, that presentation was about what's happening abroad in tech and everything. Yeah. You spent some time in Asia. What's it like there in the restaurant industry in terms of those forward thinking or these new innovations, and how does that compare to the US?
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple key differences between kind of what we have here in the US and specifically around my time. I spent most of my time running our Burger King portfolio in Asia, which is about 3,000 restaurants across 20 countries. But number one is, I think, the speed at which things move and kind of if you can get a restaurant built in a month or two, that really makes things a lot easier. I can see a lot of nods in the audience because people are thinking, wow, if I could build a restaurant in a month, that would be amazing. But that's what you can do. In China, when I was there, we opened about over 300 restaurants in 1 year. And about 100 of those, if I'm correct, were in December. We're in 1 month. And that was truly incredible to see. But that speed allows you to say, okay, then if I want to open 5 of this format, I'll get it up and running and see what it does. And it makes that risk tolerance a lot greater. I think the second thing, sort of the difference that I see, is kind of the embrace of delivery. And because the service level is so good on delivery. So, from my time living in Singapore, I always laugh because I felt like the dinosaur in my office because I would go down to pick up my lunch every day. But all the kids in the office, they were all getting their lunch on delivery. And I said, well, that's going to take so long. They said, no, it's going to actually be faster and more efficient for me to order on delivery because it's going to come in 15 or 20 minutes. Whereas you're going to walk outside, it's going to take you 15 or 20 minutes to go get your lunch. And that was something new for me too, is that the speed and efficiency of delivery, that's what the experience is about. And if you can get that right, and you can get the quality aspect of it right, then it's going to be 50% of your business. It could be something much larger. And so I think those were the two key differences that I saw in the business, and it made people a lot more willing to test out new formats, test out new ideas to kind of accelerate that aspect of the business.
Okay. We talked about the acceleration of experimentation, and you've adopted this completely new mindset now. This is the speed that you're moving at. We're coming up with all these things. We're testing them. Do you ever think about how do we stop ourselves from slipping back to before? Like, how do you maintain this? Do you need to maintain it? Is it the new? I mean, we talk about the new normal. I hate that phrase, but I mean, how do we go back to an old normal? How do we not go back to an old normal?
It's an interesting question because I think we, all of us as kind of leaders in the industry, we're always innovating, right? As you think about products in our restaurants and the menus, innovation is at the core of everything we do in the industry. I think maybe this was an area where we weren't innovating as fast, right? I think that we had new formats. We were always experimenting with new formats. We had an app already. We were already experimenting with digital ideas, but it forced us to move faster. And I think it's not a bad thing, right? I think when the consumer goes a direction and almost forces you to go that direction, that's not a bad thing. I don't think we're at any risk of falling backwards. I actually think, if anything, it's shown us as restaurant operators is that even with restaurant systems of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 restaurants, we can actually be pretty nimble. And a really good example is I look at things like contactless delivery, which is like this phrase that we all use now as a buzzword. But I remember being in China during the pandemic when we were starting, and contactless delivery, right? This just idea of the delivery driver not having contact with the guest and having some sort of security around the packaging and things like that. That was something we were forced to do because if we didn't adapt, our business would not have survived during COVID. And so I think when things like that happen, it shows that all of us can actually be a lot more nimble than we give ourselves credit for.
Yeah. Looking at the time, I do want to open it up to some questions in just a bit. But let's talk about labor. We touched on, you've already talked about the things that you're doing in back of house and making it a nicer experience for employees. And I mean, the reality is it's going to get tougher and tougher to get people into QSR positions. That's as far as I can tell. I mean, what the hell do I know, actually? But it's not easy. So I guess apart from those things that you're doing in back of house, is there anything either on the tech front or culturally that you're thinking of? We have Checkers and Rallies speaking tomorrow, and they're mucking around with an AI drive-through system. So, I mean, do you want to drop any bombshells? Any big things that you got coming to help with this problem?
You know, I would drop a bombshell if I had one to drop, but I think
That's a lie. That's a lie. No.
I would tell you that, and I speak with restaurant operators every day, our franchisees, and it's about evolution, not revolution. I think when it comes to labor, I think for a lot of the folks who have run restaurants, you know, it's something that we know how to do, right? And I think, you know, when it comes to hiring, training, recognition, creating a great experience for the team member, creating a culture of engagement. These are the things that mattered 10 years ago. They matter more today, but it does come down to the basics. And I, you know, when I'm speaking with our franchisees, I'll tell you, and actually I was in a restaurant 2 weeks ago with one of our franchisees, and he actually has 200 or so restaurants, and is one of our best operators in the system. And through the pandemic, he said he only lost 5 general managers across 200 restaurants. Only 5 general managers.
What's happening there? How did they achieve that then?
And that's what I thought was super interesting, because when I went to meet with him, it wasn't just meeting with him, it was meeting with his training manager, it was meeting with his head of recruiting, his staffing coordinators, it was meeting his head of operations. They create a holistic culture that puts the team member first. It's, you know, and you know, it's funny, I say training, but I asked, well, what kind of training do you bring to your team members? And they said, actually, it's training in a lot of things. If our team members want to know, you know, want leadership training, it's leadership training. If it's, actually, they talked about computer skills and financial skills. If they want to know how to read a P&L and actually look through all the tools, we provide those training tools to them as well. And so I think it's holistic, and actually, the one thing that stood out to me most was he knew every single team member's name in the restaurant. Every single team member's name. And so the best franchisees, the best operators, they're not running their restaurants from their desks. They're not running it from Zoom. They're not running it from Outlook. They're in the restaurants. They're operating their restaurants. They're leading from the front of the pack. And that's always been the case in our industry, is that the best restaurant operators do that. And I think the pandemic gave some an excuse not to do that. But as we get back to that, the restaurants, there are a lot of restaurants that are fully staffed out there right now that are not experiencing labor problems. And the only clear difference in my mind is the culture at that restaurant.
Okay. And when you stumble across these kind of experiences at the ground level then, and I guess how has your thinking changed about how we run our organizations and how maybe we can, not just in the restaurant, but, you know, keep fostering this innovation and a willingness and an ability to go beyond what we've got? So have you changed your thinking around that? Have you become inspired through any of it, through much of this?
I think I've been inspired in the sense that, in the same, you know, it's only it sort of accentuated the importance in my mind of being on the front lines for us. Like, and so in a world where I think when, you know, everyone talks about remote work and being virtual, which, you know, at our corporate offices, we are being a lot more flexible. We have more hybrid work. But I encourage the folks who aren't in the office when they're not in the office to actually be in the restaurants, right? Because ultimately, that's where we're serving the guests. That's where the best ideas happen. That's where formats like this, that's where they emerge from, right? It's because the team member says, hey, you know what? This is a real pain point for me. I would love an escape door so that I can go, you know, deliver curbside pickup that much easier. And then we have an escape door in our new format, right? I think it's things like that you don't get on a Zoom. You won't get it there. There are a lot of things that can be done efficiently on a Zoom, and I'll tell you, I have many Zooms every day, but at the same time, I try to spend those other days in the restaurants.
Okay. Yeah, we're coming towards the end here, and I just wanted to throw it open to anyone here. I don't know if we have a microphone floating around, but does anyone have a question that they'd like to throw up here at Sami? Oh, come on. No. Sure, we just one down here. A microphone's coming.
Hey, Sami, thanks. That was a great presentation. I think in your public earnings statements, they had that Popeyes had negative comps, which I think is the first time. You guys have had a really good run. You had the chicken sandwich, and then COVID, 1-2 punch. It's just awesome. What are you doing to change that negative comp sales, and because it's going to have a significant impact on franchisees' commitments to developing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, kind of stepping back, I think as you look at 2019 and 2020, we had 2-year comps of around 30%, and so as we came into 2021. We were slightly negative, but I think what we saw was the biggest driver of that was honestly the labor and staffing crunch. As you look at it, the vast majority was driven by restaurants being open less hours. And that's a problem that we know is kind of facing the entire industry. And getting our restaurants just back to those normal hours of operation, that's the first step for us. And we're starting to actually, the great news is I was talking to a bunch of operators last week. They're seeing the staffing levels come back. We're seeing actually hours of operation expand a little bit. So we're kind of getting back to where we were a few years ago. But I think as we think about kind of holistically and long-term kind of where growth is going to come from, I think number one is and we've always been kind of at the forefront of this, culinary innovation. I think we didn't talk a lot about our food today, but our food is what drives people to Popeyes. I think when we kind of do all this panel research, our guests always tell us, you have the best tasting chicken in the industry, routinely. Blind taste test, branded taste test, whatever it is, you have great food. But it's these other things that you need to improve to kind of get the growth in the business. And number one, as I mentioned, was convenience. Number two, actually, is service, right? And I think as we think about guest service, we have a lot of folks who may come into our restaurant for that great tasting food and not have the best experience. So we're focused a lot on that team member experience to elevate the service. And you're absolutely right. Ultimately, it comes down to ROIs on new development. And I think the beauty of it is even, you know, despite kind of the results of last year, over the last 3 years, we have one of the best ROIs of any new concept, of any kind of new build in QSR. And we're going to keep leaning into that. And actually, you know, one of the things Peter and I were talking about this morning was, as we think more about format diversity, how do we get those ROIs to be that much better for the franchisees? I think the format diversity is a big part of getting those ROIs where we want them.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah? Not sure where the microphone is. There we go.
Hey, great store. Quick question. So, sorry. I'm used to, obviously, the Popeyes of old, whereas the orangish kind of building with the Juliet balconies, very New Orleans style architecture. And I'm curious, what were the thoughts behind not only your team, but the marketing department to say that we're going to go in a new direction, first off, and then that the new direction is going to be this, right? More modern, and on some of the interior renderings, looks like it was kind of a mid-century modern kind of vibe there. So what was the thought? Where's Popeyes trying to go with this new design aesthetic?
It's a great question, and I want everyone to rest assured we are not going to deviate from our kind of Cajun Louisiana roots, because it's core to the food, but it's kind of core to the experience and who we are. And actually, you saw some of the images today. I think a lot of the images you saw were from China and Spain and the Philippines. So it's a bit of an evolution, a bit of more of a modern and actually probably more premiumized concept in a lot of the markets we're launching. So for example, in China, where we launched a couple years ago, the idea was there's a big competitor in the market that has 7,000 restaurants who will not be named, but they're our competition. And so we tried to go in a little bit more premium, and we went a little bit more premium with the design inspiration. As you look at kind of this prototype, which is actually being built in the US right now, it is still very New Orleans, right? It is still very New Orleans with the pops of teal and orange. As you kind of walk into the restaurant, you'll see kind of artwork about sort of the freshly made food and the hand battering and breading. And so I think we didn't stray too far from our Louisiana roots. And I think the other piece that you're also seeing with format innovation is also image diversity, right? So if you're on Canal Street in New Orleans, which is actually where we just remodeled one of our flagship restaurant, you will see a lot more kind of in terms of, you'll see the Poppy is the name of this chicken, and Poppy will be playing a saxophone. And there's sort of music, there's jazz elements to it, and that's for New Orleans. But if we're building somewhere else in the world, we're trying to localize a little bit more. And I know a lot of concepts have successfully done this, but Popeyes is big in our communities, in the communities that we operate in. And so we want to have that local connection with the communities when we build our restaurants.
Probably have time for one more question if someone would like to ask it. Yeah.
Hey guys, remember me? Right to exactly what you're talking about. So my question is, how do you partner with the franchisees in marketing, meaning social media, team member highlights? How do you make them feel part of the overall brand? Do you encourage UGC? And this is based on just looking at your IG real quick. Or do you focus more like in-house marketing efforts?
It's a great question and a very timely question, because we're sort of rethinking about how we do a lot of this, and you actually see, it's timely that this artwork comes up. We have a whole campaign around what we call UGP, user generated Popeyes, and now we have what we call EGP, employee generated Popeyes. And so we want the team members in our restaurants to feel comfortable to be who they are, and that starts with the franchisees, right? Because the franchisees have to create an environment where the team members feel engaged and they feel willing to kind of be themselves in the restaurants. And so when it comes to kind of working with our franchisees, we bring them in early and often. I think I touch base with our franchise system at least once a week, whether it's through an email communication, through a video, through a webcast, whatever the form of communication. It's at least once a week. But we have advisory councils who are actually very involved in the marketing side of things. So a lot of our franchisees actually help create a lot of these things. And actually, when I tour restaurants, if I meet a manager, I meet a team member who I'm like, oh wow, that would be a perfect person for a social or digital campaign, we get their name, we bring them into it. So I think it's a lot more of like a on-the-ground grassroots effort driving the brand, because ultimately that's what our brand is. It is an authentic Louisiana brand. We don't want to ever appear too corporate. We don't ever want to appear too contrived. It's almost about embracing kind of that messiness and that authenticity in kind of what we do.
Great, and look, we're out of time, Sami, but this has been a really lovely talk, and I just want to ask one last question though, and forgive my candidness here. I like to ask everybody this, particularly in your position. Is there anything, when you think about the industry as a whole, is there anything that kind of pisses you off, or have you got like a pet peeve about maybe what the industry isn't doing or should be thinking more about? And on the other side of the coin, then, what are you most excited about when you think about the future?
Maybe it's not a pet peeve exactly, but I think what's interesting about this conference and this space is we spend a lot of time talking about digital innovation and innovation in formats and growing faster, but we don't spend enough time, in my view, talking about back-of-house technology. I really think that there are so many things that are antiquated, and I'm speaking on behalf of Popeyes, but I've seen it in every other restaurant concept that I've worked with or walked into, is that as you think about labor scheduling, you think about production management, you think about the integration of all these tools, we're talking, we often spend a lot of time talking about AI and all these things, but if we can get some of those basics right, that's huge improvement in labor and team member experience and food cost and profitability for franchisees. So I think we need to spend a lot of time talking about the less sexy things, innovation in the back of house. And I think on that same token, what I'm really excited about actually is a lot of the things that we are doing on that side. And it's starting with actually, one of the things that we've been in development with for a while, which we can talk a lot about, but I'll keep it short, which is our own POS system. So we are developing our own POS that can actually integrate these back of house technologies, let sort of systems speak to one another, and then also enhance that guest-facing digital experience. Because if your app and your kiosks and drone delivery one day all have a single point of sort of single source on the POS, then you can do a lot of things. So we're building that platform right now. I'm very excited. Well,
that's it's interesting you mentioned that, because and what conversations we don't have, because here at RestaurantSpaces, in our next edition in the fall and onwards, we're changing the focus of our event, and it's going to be the intersection of design and technology. So we might have to get you back, or someone else in your team, to talk about that. But look, Sami Siddiqui, look, thank you so much. It's really wonderful. I don't know about you guys, but I really enjoyed this conversation. So a big hand for Sami.
Thank you. Appreciate it so much.
Appreciate it.